Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this auspicious occasion. 40 years ago, on 26 March 1975, the Biological Weapons Convention entered into force, with ceremonies in London, Moscow, and Washington. As we all know, the WBC was the world's first treaty to effectively prohibit an entire category of weapon of mass destruction. This year's 40th anniversary is therefore an occasion worth commemorating. I would like to express my thanks to the depository government of the BWC, the Russian Federation, the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, the United States of America, and the Implementation Support Unit for arranging for this event, and also to the United Kingdom for providing financial support. This morning's event is intended to have a mainly historical and commemorative focus. There will also be an academic seminar this afternoon, starting at 1400, 2 o'clock, which has been arranged by the Geneva Center for Security Policy, the Center for Conflict Development and Peace Building, and the United Nations Institute for Disarmament Research. I encourage you all to attend until the reception this evening. Taking a leaf from our own personal lives, an anniversary is a significant milestone. It gives an opportunity to reflect upon the past and also to think about the future. It is also a time to be shared with friends and colleagues. And I am pleased that we have many such people present today from governments, international organizations, and civil society. Geneva was the birthplace of BWC, as you can see from the screen. And it has hosted every BWC meeting since its birth. So it is only fitting to now pass the floor to Mr. Michael Moller, the Acting Director General of the United Nations Office in Geneva, for some welcoming remark. Mr. Moller, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Excellencies, dear colleagues, good morning. It's a great pleasure to be here with you to mark the 40th anniversary of the entry into force of the Biological Weapons Convention, our first multilateral treaty to ban an entire category of weapons of mass destruction. A warm thank you to Ambassador Mohammed in his capacity as the chair of the 2015 BWC meeting of state parties for organizing this event together with the Implementation Support Unit. As you have probably already seen on the way in here in the photos displayed outside, International Geneva and the collective struggle against biological warfare are closely connected. It was here in Geneva in 1925 that states agreed the Geneva Protocol, prohibiting the use in war of both chemical and biological weapons. So it is really a double anniversary year, celebrating 90 years since the Geneva Protocol and the first 40 years of the BWC, which together highlight the long-standing and deep-rooted tradition for disarmament efforts here in our city. And as we're also marking this year the 70th anniversary of the United Nations as an organization, we are reminded of the central place of disarmament in our mission to build a better world. Sorry about that. There can be no more appropriate venue for this celebration than the Council Chamber. It was here that the conference of the Committee on Disarmament, one of the predecessors of our Conference on Disarmament today, spent some 2 years negotiating the BWC before it was finally adopted in September 1971. No doubt the murals by José María Sert that depict human progress through health, technology, freedom and peace provided inspiration. And these 4 themes still capture the main objectives of the Convention. The BWC is a cornerstone in our effort to ensure that public health is not endangered through the deliberate use of germs and disease as weapons, what has sometimes been referred to as public health in reverse. And while technology can present challenges to a regime like the BWC, it also provides us with a defense against biological weapons. And as a disarmament measure, the Convention is an integral part of broader efforts to ensure that we can all live in freedom from fear and in peace. As we look ahead to what some have called the century of biology, we will need to build upon the norm embodied in the BWC a norm that has already been accepted by 173 state parties to ensure that the incredible advances in science and technology are applied responsibly. We can only achieve this by working in partnership, drawing on the expertise and engagement of all stakeholders. It is my firm conviction that it is through partnerships that we will advance disarmament most effectively, not just in the area of biological weapons, but also more broadly. And it is therefore a particular pleasure to welcome today colleagues from science, academia and civil society and the many students here. We will rely on your commitment in the years ahead to strengthen disarmament norms and to ensure that they are respected by all. This anniversary is a most poignant and timely reminder of what is possible in this chamber when there is collective will to move forward our peace and security agenda. Together with landmark instruments such as the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, the Chemical Weapons Convention and the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, the BWC forms part of the proud tradition of visionary agreements negotiated in this chamber that have helped build a safer and more secure world for all of us. As we are now in the 19th year of inaction in the Conference on Disarmament, I hope that this anniversary will inspire all members to again find the spirit of compromise and common cause that will allow us to move ahead with new multilateral negotiations. I wish the BWC continued success in the future with the support of all member states and all partners, and I thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Moller. Ladies and gentlemen, the United Nations, particularly the Office of Disarmament Affairs, has played a key role in the life of the Convention to date. It is therefore appropriate to hear now a brief video message from the High Representative for Disarmament Affairs, Ms. Angela Kane.
It is my pleasure to send this message to you, the states parties to the Biological Weapons Convention, on this historic occasion, the 40th anniversary of that groundbreaking treaty. It is widely known that the BWC was the first international treaty to effectively prohibit an entire class of weapons of mass destruction. Yet the BWC's other major achievement is equally important: the creation of an ironclad norm against the possession and use of biological weapons, and the abhorrence associated with the very idea of using disease as a weapon. How many states today boast that they are biological weapon states? Who argues now that the bubonic plague and smallpox are legitimate weapons to use under any circumstances? Who speaks of a bioweapon umbrella? This norm is a testament to the importance of the BWC and the role its states parties and, more recently, the BWC Implementation Support Unit have played in strengthening both the treaty and norm over the course of the last 4 decades. Of course, it is a norm that requires constant cultivation and would be made ever more robust through universal membership and implementation of the treaty. After 40 years, there can be no justification for any state remaining outside the Convention. In today's increasingly complex geopolitical environment, the challenges posed by biological threats are not dissipating. If anything, they're becoming more complex. Remarkable biotechnological breakthroughs are occurring in parallel with proliferation concerns, such as the interest in biological weapons shown by some terrorist or insurgent groups. The human consequences of the outbreak of any one of today's deadly and highly contagious diseases highlight the devastation diseases can wreak. The nightmare scenario in which such a disease is deliberately released as a weapon must be avoided at all costs. These emerging challenges and opportunities highlight the importance of the BWC in the 21st century. The 40th anniversary, as well as next year's review conference, provides a valuable opportunity for you, the states parties, to ensure the BWC remains the effective bulwark against the spread or use of biological weapons. It has been since it entered into force in 1975.
Distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, as we have already heard, the BWC is an important treaty within the international architecture against weapons of mass destruction, and it represents a strong norm against the weaponization of disease. The strength of the abhorrence that we as humans feel against the use of disease as a weapon is clear in the preamble of the Convention, where such use is described as repugnant to the conscience of mankind. Today, 173 states have registered their support for this norm by becoming party of the BWC, and several others are very close to doing so. However, we cannot rest on our laurels. The negotiation and entry into force of the BWC were key moments in its life. But like any international agreement, the BWC needs tending. Over the years, attention to the BWC has waxed and waned, but without such attention, there is a danger that a treaty could lose its relevance and its connection with relevant developments in the wider world. That is why the intersessional process is important. It helps to maintain the Convention's relevance and make sure that its state parties tend the BWC implementation. It is therefore good to be having this event now in March, when the BWC is not normally in people's mind here in Geneva. While many of you are now turning your attention to the NPT Review Conference, which will take place soon in New York, it is very encouraging to see here today to spend time considering the past, present, and future of the BWC. Tending this treaty should be an ongoing activity, not something confined to only 2 weeks of the year. Over the past 3 years, we have had good discussions about the standing agenda items: assistance and cooperation, national implementation, and science and technology, and the biennial items, the confidence-building measures, and Article 7. Over these years, we have been able to reach new common understandings as reflected in the reports of the meetings of these parties. It is now important for us to focus on the effective action part of the mandate given to us by the 7th Review Conference. Hopefully, the discussions today will assist us in this regard, as we look forward to this year's meeting of experts in August and meeting of state parties in December. As we all know, the BWC has 3 depository governments, to whom Article 14 of the Convention gives special responsibilities as regards to the functioning of the treaty, and in particular regarding the membership of the BWC. It is gratifying that BWC today has 173 state parties, with a very recent accession by Andorra. I will now give the floor to the representative of each of the depository states for some remarks on this important occasion. First, I give the floor to Mr. Mikhail Ulyanov, Director, Department for Non-Proliferation and Arms Control, Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Russian Federation. Mr. Ulyanov, you have the floor.
Thank you. Dear colleagues, it gives me great pleasure to address you on the occasion of the 40th anniversary of entry into force of the Biological Weapons Convention. 4 decades ago, the BWC became, as our chairman and Angela Kane rightly put it, became the first international treaty to ban an entire category of weapons of mass destruction. In 1975, it was a major step forward for the whole mankind. Today, the Convention continues to serve as an important element in the legal framework of WMD disarmament. That being so, from the very start, and we should acknowledge this objective fact, the BWC has been beset by numerous shortcomings, seriously weakening the effectiveness of its regime. The most obvious one is the absence in its provisions of measures for strict and effective international control over compliance. In that respect, the BWC differs radically from the Non-Proliferation Treaty and the Chemical Weapons Convention, which both are equipped with functional systems of monitoring compliance. It is highly unlikely that any of the latter would have materialized without a mechanism of verification, but surprisingly for the BWC, such absence is not only being tolerated, but almost perpetuated. Against such background, the threat posed by biological weapons remains real and even grows as science and technology develop rather fast. While the weakness of the original text of the BWC may be explained by conditions prevailing then on the international arena, further efforts to strengthen the convention have also experienced serious difficulties. I would like to remind you that at the second review conference in 1986, the Soviet Union proposed to develop a compliance control mechanism for the BWC and to launch international negotiations to that end. It became possible to begin that only in 1995. Those negotiations were preceded by the work of the group of governmental experts, so-called VEREX, which concluded by consensus in 1993 that verification measures would, I quote, contribute to strengthening the effectiveness and improve the implementation of the convention, end of quotation. Such measures were supposed to enhance confidence in compliance with and credibility of BWC. In 1994, the BWC special conference agreed by consensus the mandate to be pursued by a negotiating organ that it established, the ad hoc group open to all states parties. The objective of this group was to consider appropriate measures and proposals to strengthen the convention to be included in a legally binding instrument, also known as the protocol, to be submitted for the consideration of states parties. The negotiations in the ad hoc group from 1995 to 2001 made steady and significant progress. However, in 2001, when work on the protocol was entering its final stage, with a view to submitting a legally binding instrument for consideration at the fifth review conference, the entire process was completely derailed because of the change in political climate. A failed revolution, as some call it, became a real setback to the efforts of all states parties to make the BWC deliver on its promise to exclude completely the possibility of biological agents being used as weapons. Such demoralizing failure continues to accompany us to this day, preventing serious multilateral endeavors in the BWC to reduce the threat posed by biological weapons. In the absence of the BWC implementing agency that would take care of the convention's well-being, Russia, as a depository, feels a special responsibility in that regard. We also remain concerned about biological weapons and the threat of their actual use. Therefore, last year we launched 2 BWC-related initiatives. First was a survey of states parties seeking their views on resumption of negotiations based on the 1994 mandate on a legally binding instrument. We received replies from 42 states parties, and the majority of respondents gave an affirmative answer. The result of the survey was assessed by us as encouraging in a sense that the majority favored resumption of negotiations. However, a considerable number of states parties from one regional group made it clear that since there was there was currently no consensus on verification in the BWC, there would be no support from them to negotiate what they called the verification protocol. Taking into account the results of that survey, we made an attempt to find a way out of the deadlock that we have been experiencing since 2001. We came to the conclusion that verification at this stage is not feasible, and we ruled it out for pragmatic purposes. I would like to repeat it once again, specifically for some of my Western colleagues. We don't propose to negotiate a verification mechanism, at least at this stage, for pragmatic reasons. A proposal was developed for a mechanism to investigate alleged use and specific provisions for assistance and protection in case of actual use taking place. Other elements, such as promotion of international cooperation for peaceful purposes, national implementation, confidence-building measures, and permanent advisory organ for monitoring science and technology developments, were added to the package. Such package, to be shaped as a legally binding instrument, would have established an organization for the prohibition of biological weapons, open to all BWC states parties who find merit in their participation. I would like to underline that we speak about a rather compact body, much smaller than OPCW, but a little bit bigger than the current implementation support unit. We made an initial presentation of the above ideas on the 5th of August last year in the margins of the BWC meeting of experts. The intent was to float this concept and to see whether there was interest among states parties for pursuing such an approach with a view to reaching specific understandings at the 8th Review Conference in December of 2016 and resuming negotiations thereafter. At this stage, our assessment is that the proposed concept is feasible and may be developed further together with the interested states parties. The main challenge is to overcome inertia and a perception of failure prevailing in the BWC environment since 2001. Yes, we can should be the motto in our collective endeavor to strengthen the Convention and reduce the threat of biological weapons. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ulyanov. Next, I would like to give the floor to Mr. John Walker from the Foreign and Commonwealth Office of the United Kingdom. Mr. Walker, you have the floor.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, first of all, to the Implementation Support Unit and our fellow depositories, the Russian Federation and the United States, for making the arrangements for today's event to mark the 40th anniversary of the entry into force of the Biological and Toxin Weapons Convention. And it is fitting, too, that we are meeting in the Council chamber, where the CD's predecessor bodies, first the 18-Nation Disarmament Committee and then the Conference of the Committee on Disarmament, convened during the original negotiations that led to the adoption of the text of the Convention. Although we are unable to meet on the exact anniversary, we are close enough to that day in 1975 when the first significant step on the road to chemical and biological disarmament was taken by the international community. The United Kingdom has always had a keen interest in this convention. We were its founders, and for 40 years we have been at the forefront of efforts to ensure its effectiveness and continued relevance in an ever-changing world. On a personal level, I might also observe that I've been part of these efforts in the Foreign Office for 30 years, which explains the grey hairs. The 1960s were watershed years in the history of multilateral arms control and disarmament. Until that point in time, grandiose plans and proposals for general and complete disarmament had come to naught, foundering on the rocks of Cold War suspicion and distrust. Following the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, East and West realised that urgent measures were required to constrain and roll back the nuclear arms race and to enhance international security and stability. A partial test ban treaty was the first result of this sea change in the summer of 1963, although efforts have been underway since 1958 on securing a comprehensive nuclear test ban treaty. The next priority was to seek what was originally known as a non-dissemination treaty, and between 1965 and 1968 negotiations led to the opening for signature of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty on 1st July 1968. It was against this background that we find the specific origins of the Biological Weapons Convention. British officials in the Foreign Office were tasked to identify the next concrete arms control measure that could be pursued by the United Kingdom following conclusion of the NPT. An internal review came up with three options, one of which was to do something on CBW. The other two concerned the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty and peaceful nuclear explosions. The UK then went on to present a working paper in Geneva in August 1968, setting out the arguments for a new initiative that would deal exclusively with the problem of BW. Chemical weapons were deemed too difficult to tackle for a range of reasons at that time and should be left for later attention. In the following year, a draft convention prohibiting the production, development and use of biological weapons was tabled in July by the then Minister of State at the Foreign Office, Fred Mulley. However, in 1969, the USSR and its Warsaw Pact allies and states from the non-aligned movement were not yet ready to abandon the ideal of a single agreement dealing with both chemical weapons and biological weapons. There were concerns too that dealing with biological weapons separately and the express prohibition on use would undermine the 1925 Geneva Protocol. It was not until March 1971 that the USSR came to the view that a separate ban on BW was worth supporting. So over the period between March to September of that year, the final decisive round of negotiations took place. In this process, three critical elements were lost from the original UK draft: express prohibitions on offensive research and BW use, and a procedure for investigations into alleged use. The consequences of these decisions were to reverberate down the years of the Convention in force. States parties sought at the first review conference in 1980 to strengthen the Convention's basic compliance procedures and have continued to do so ever since. Since 1975, the Convention has had, in many respects, a troubled existence, as it has tried to grapple with its compliance aspects. We have been through 7 review conferences, meetings of verification experts, a special conference, an ad hoc group, a consultative committee, and 3 intersessional work programmes. There have been significant compliance problems too over the years, with offensive BW programmes coming to light. Finding consensus on the best way of making the Convention more effective has proved and continues to prove elusive. We are approaching the 8th review conference, and many of these issues that have been at the heart of the challenge facing BW disarmament since 1975 remain the same for today's generation of diplomats and experts. These issues include coping with scientific and technological change and the associated dual use problem, how to strengthen the Convention's compliance mechanisms where the verification conundrum remains as unforgiving as ever, achieving the proper balance between security and cooperation, ensuring effective national implementation, achieving universality, and the comparative low priority that BW disarmament attracts in policy-making circles. Despite these challenges, the Convention remains fundamental to international efforts to combat the misuse of the life sciences for hostile purposes. Public health in reverse, as it was once famously put. It is in everyone's interest that the Convention remains effective and that its prohibitions continue to be upheld and that its proper place in combating infectious disease is recognised. Possession of biological weapons is illegal under international law, and the Convention is a keystone in the global architecture erected to counter the threat of BW. Any use of BW would be illegal too. Not only illegal too, but repugnant to the conscience of mankind, and no effort should be spared to minimise the risk, as the words of the Convention's preamble has it. We must all keep this very pertinent objective to the fore in our future national and collective efforts to sustain the Convention in the coming years as we enter another decade of its existence. Our aim now must be to ensure that the Convention remains relevant and even more effective in its 50th year. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Walker. Finally, I would like to give the floor to Ambassador Robert Wood, Permanent Representative of the United States of America to the Conference on Disarmament. Mr. Ambassador, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for your leadership of the BWC this year. Mr. Chairman, Excellencies, distinguished colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, 40 years after its entry into force, the Biological Weapons Convention continues to be an essential element in the international community's efforts to prohibit and eliminate such weapons, the use of which the Convention's preamble so aptly states, quote, would be repugnant to the conscience of mankind, unquote. While not yet universal, the BWC is the centerpiece of a global norm that possession and use of these weapons are unacceptable. During these 4 decades, we have witnessed astounding innovations in the life sciences that represent remarkable progress. Such advances contribute to a brighter future for all people around the world and reflect both the tremendous possibilities and great success of international cooperation in this field. At the same time, with these advances, technology has become more easily accessible, putting the biological weapons within reach of a much wider array of individuals and groups. President Obama has acknowledged that, quote, we are more susceptible to bioterrorism than ever, unquote, but pledged that, quote, as we take action to counter these threats, we will work together to advance our own health security and provide for the improved condition of all humanity, unquote. The world has changed. The nature of the biological weapons threat has changed, and our approach to the Biological Weapons Convention needs to keep pace. Allow me to address some of the main challenges to the BWC as we look toward its next 40 years. The primary objective of the United States and the BWC is to work with other states parties to strengthen the Convention as an instrument for combating bioweapons proliferation and terrorism. We will continue to emphasize the importance of effective national implementation of the BWC and of transparency regarding implementation as a means of assuring other states parties about compliance with the Convention. And we will continue to be active in providing practical assistance to other states parties that contributes to implementation and transparency. The scientific advances and spread of technology I mentioned earlier offer incredible benefits, but they also pose thorny questions for those who seek to ensure that biological weapons will never again be used. How do we ensure that the life sciences are used for solely peaceful purposes while still promoting their broad access to those benefits and further advancement in these fields? We know some of the answers. Effective export controls, strong biosafety and biosecurity, active outreach, and awareness raising. But these are challenging issues and require ongoing attention. Recently, the United States and the international community have begun to grapple with a specific dual-use challenge, what we have come to call dual-use research of concern. This is legitimate life science research that can be reasonably anticipated to provide knowledge, information, products, or technologies that could be directly misapplied to pose a significant threat with broad potential consequences to public health and safety, agricultural crops and other plants, animals, the environment, material, or national security. We must work to preserve the benefits of life science research while taking steps to minimize the risk of misuse of products of such research by monitoring and mitigating such risks throughout the research process. In addition to banning biological weapons, BWC Article 7 commits states parties to provide assistance to any other state party if the UN Security Council decides, quote, that such party has been exposed to danger as a result of violation of the Convention, unquote. Since it can be difficult and time-consuming to determine whether biological weapons have been used, much of what needs to be done to fulfill this provision for assistance is also necessary to prepare for and respond to outbreaks of disease that occur naturally. This, in turn, means that the work of the BWC is closely tied to global efforts to prepare for any type of public health emergency. As the international community considers the lessons of the Ebola outbreak in West Africa for how to prepare for future health crises, now is a good time to examine and discuss what this experience of a naturally occurring epidemic might teach us about fulfilling the assistance commitments under Article 7 in case a bioweapon were to be used anywhere in the world. The United States has made addressing infectious disease threats a high priority. In 2014, we joined with 28 other nations to launch the Global Health Security Agenda, GHSA, an international effort to accelerate progress toward a world safe and secure from infectious disease threats. GHSA partners include over 40 nations, international organizations like the World Health Organization and Interpol, non-governmental partners, and private stakeholders. The agenda seeks to elevate efforts to 1. Reduce the likelihood of outbreaks, 2. Detect outbreaks early to save lives, and 3. Respond to outbreaks effectively using the full range of multi-sectoral resources. GHSA is a multi-sectoral initiative to strengthen our collective ability to prevent, detect, and respond to disease outbreaks, whether natural, accidental, or intentional. This is an effort distinct from that of the BWC, but one that supports key aims of the Convention. The capabilities GHSA seeks to advance will make individual countries and the international community safer from the threat of biological weapons. GHSA is also a very real example of the international cooperation BWC states parties are committed to under Article 10, a mechanism to identify needs, mobilize resources, and coordinate capacity building efforts guided by established international norms such as the International Health Regulations. The fact that the 173 states have joined the Convention is an extraordinary endorsement of the BWC's principles, but we seek a convention in which all are parties. Universal membership in the Convention would reflect a truly global consensus that biological weapons are illegitimate and that all states have a responsibility to prevent anyone from obtaining them. Let us strive to reach that lofty objective well before the next 40 years of the BWC have passed. For the last 40 years, the BWC has been essential in establishing a strong international norm against biological weapons. We must aim to make it stronger still in the years and decades ahead. Dealing with universal adherence, dual-use capabilities, increased transparency, developments in science and technology, and our collective assistance obligations will not be easy, but is undeniably necessary. The BWC lays the foundation of our collective efforts to protect against the weaponization of biological agents, and it is critical for all countries to take practical steps to strengthen the most important tool we have in this effort. Thank you.
The floor is yours.
Excellencies, distinguished representatives of the depository states, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. It's an honor and a great pleasure for me to be back in Geneva to join in the celebrations of the 40th anniversary of this historic treaty, the Biological Weapons Convention, one that is so dear to my heart. I would like to thank my friend Ambassador Mazlan Mohammed, Chairman of the meetings of the states parties, and Mr. Daniel Feeks, Head of the Implementation Support Unit, for inviting me to participate in today's event. In her remarks, High Representative Angela Kane has outlined the moral, political, and legal obligations we all have as a community to promote the sublime cause of this regime. I also thank Mr. Michael Muller for his presence and important statement. Today, we commemorate a historic watershed in human history. We can all be proud of the contribution of the Biological Weapons Convention in over 40 years to make the world a safer place and to the cause of multilateralism and disarmament. We all committed that the life sciences will be used only for benign purposes, and that we will continue to fight present and future threats of their destructive use, biological warfare, and bioterrorism. The Convention has been remarkably successful in its mission of eliminating an entire class of weapons of mass destruction. It's a simple treaty, and it has some shortcomings. But over the decades, it has built a robust norm against the repugnant notion of using disease as a means of warfare. Although membership of the BWC is not yet universal, no state claims today that biological weapons are a legitimate means of national defense. This is in marked contrast to the situation in the 1950s and the 1960s. This is a testimony to the often underestimated power and influence of multilateralism and international law. It would not be an exaggeration to say that the BWC is the most successful WMD non-proliferation and disarmament regime. While celebrating the success, we must bear in mind 2 points. First, the success of the BWC does not derive from simply getting states to sign and ratify it. The regime is much more than a few pages of the text. Second, if we want to build upon the success of the BWC, we have to meet some important challenges ahead. It was realized very early in the history of the BWC that the treaty in itself would not be sufficient to erect barriers against biological weapons. The lack of verification provisions, coupled with suspicions of cheating and concerns about the implications of scientific and technological advances, led states parties to begin discussing how the convention might be strengthened, a debate which continues to this day. This debate is fundamental to the success of the treaty that we are celebrating today. The community of BWC states parties, with all its differences, is the very lifeblood of the treaty. It has collectively evolved norms and mechanisms that ensure that the advances in the life sciences, biology, and biotechnology are used only for the benefit of humanity. My own engagement with this community began when I presided over the 6th Review Conference in 2006. It was a particularly difficult time. Feelings were still raw after the collapse of the protocol negotiations and the stark divisions of the 5th Review Conference held in 2001. And yet, the BWC community was already demonstrating its resilience and resolve. The first intersessional process had revealed that for all their differences, states parties were committed to making the convention work and finding pragmatic ways to do so. When I started preparations in December 2005, member states were still in a deep quagmire of acrimony and divisions. Recriminations and standoffs cast their dark shadow on the BWC negotiations. In 2006, working together, we turned that around. With sheer determination, a sense of purpose, and a bit of ingenuity, we set the convention back on course and made the review conference a success. We found creative ways to accommodate or steer around the serious divisions amongst states parties and agreed on innovative and practical outcomes. We created an environment for engagement and results. The establishment of the Implementation Support Unit was a major step forward for the BWC, one that has made a difference in improving effectiveness of the treaty at a very modest financial cost. I want to place on record the outstanding work done by Mr. Richard Lennane, the first head of the ISU, to make the BWC a successful regime by giving it strong professional and institutional support. And I also recognize the work done by Piers Millett and Fong Wonder Bly. Also my tribute to my predecessor, Ambassador Tibor Toth, and my successor, Ambassador Paul Warner Eisel, for their leadership of the 5th and the 7th Review Conferences, respectively. We were also successful in creating synergies between the BWC, OPCW, the United Nations, WHO, FAO, and OIE, and between the BWC member states, industry, and academic institutions. Our motto at that time was, from adjacency to synergy. We succeeded in promoting that goal. The renewed intersessional process brought in a wide range of actors from outside the traditional security and arms control communities and built vital links with public health and scientific organizations, the private sector, and civil society. We also used the shoestring resources of the ISU and the chair of the BWC meetings to accelerate the pace of ratifications. I'm glad that today states parties number stands at 173. The movement towards universality must continue. I also congratulate the states parties on the success of the last review conference. This brings me to my second point. Our struggle is far from over. Indeed, fulfilling the goals of the BWC is a never-ending and ever-evolving challenge. A fundamental shift in the way the BWC has been perceived has taken place over the past 15 years, with a widespread recognition that biological weapons are just one part of a spectrum of biological risks, such as naturally occurring disease, laboratory accidents, and so on, and that this spectrum of risks must be dealt with in an integrated and coordinated manner. We cannot meet the challenges confronting the BWC regime by standing still and relying on our past successes. Biological science and technology continue to advance at a breathtaking speed. At the same time, the global security situation evolves in unpredictable and alarming ways. Asymmetric warfare, terrorism, violent extremism, and twisted ideologies have multiplied security threats in many parts of the world. The BWC community must respond to these challenges effectively. We should continue to invest in preparedness and response to avert and manage an unforeseen hostile outbreak of disease. It's a little worrying that within the BWC community, political differences are once again creeping up, and there appears to be a reluctance to work together constructively. We should reverse this drift. We must generate the political will to resolve divisive issues, or, more pragmatically, to work around them in the collective interest of strengthening the Convention. All states parties agree that the Implementation Support Unit has demonstrated extraordinary performance in the past 9 years. As a minuscule secretariat supporting the BWC, the ISU should not remain a poor, inadequately equipped relative of the muscular secretariats of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty and the Chemical Weapons Convention. It is high time that the ISU is expanded and developed to its full potential. Similarly, we must overcome reluctance to explore new ideas that might help deal with contentious issues, such as compliance, verification, and Article 10. There is already a long record of states collaborating on a wide range of issues in a collegial and constructive fashion. We should now tackle some of our historical problems with an open mind and renewed entrepreneurial spirit. We are a large and diverse family, but in the end, we know where our common interests lie, And we know that the BWC is something we must treasure, respect, defend, and promote. Ladies and gentlemen, Pakistan signed the BWC in 1972 and ratified it in 1974. We oppose development, production, or stockpiling of biological weapons and agents. Over the years, Pakistan has worked diligently with other member states to strengthen the BWC regime. We have also advocated the rights of states to access biological and toxin materials and technology for research and for peaceful purposes, for medicine and agriculture and industry. Pakistan is investing in the development of the life sciences and biotechnology. We have a good institutional base, sound infrastructure, and a pool of scientists to sustain this effort. As we do so, we have enforced stringent biosecurity and biosafety measures and export controls. Before I conclude, I would quote from a very incisive piece written by David Fidler of the Council on Foreign Relations. Mr. Fidler calls the BWC as a model for regulating dual-use cyber technologies because the treaty attempts to advance scientific progress while preventing its exploitation for hostile purposes. Second, the biological sciences' increasing dependence on information technologies makes cybersecurity a growing risk and thus a threat to BWC objectives. Let's demonstrate that we can collectively counter this emerging threat. The international community should remain vigilant and prepared to deal with the threats of bioterrorism, as well as deliberate or accidental releases of pathogens that can affect health, food staples, and raw materials and cause havoc. Let's move forward with renewed determination and common purpose to ensure that the goals of this landmark treaty, the Biological Weapons Convention, continue to be realized. Distinguished representatives of the depository states, Ambassador Mazlan Mohammed and Mr. Daniel Feeks, I wish you all and the BWC community success this year and in 2016. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Masood. Now, finally, this morning's session, I would like to pass the floor to Dr. Catriona McLeish from the University of Sussex, who, along with colleagues from University College of London, also present here today, is working on an academic project on the history of the BWC. Dr. McLeish, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Your Excellencies, distinguished representatives, colleagues, a few weeks ago I celebrated my birthday, and in my family this always includes us gathering, and over food we'll tell stories about the person whose birthday it is. We'll recall our favourite memories of them, and also perhaps recall the few moments that they had wished were long forgotten. The gift given is the simple act of coming together and of demonstrating through our stories that they make our lives better, fuller, funnier. Today we're all here to celebrate the Biological Weapons Convention's birthday. 40 years, and to be precise 4 days ago, the BWC entered into force, having achieved well over its required threshold of deposited instruments of ratification. The act of us coming here today to celebrate this treaty is a modest gift, but it is an important one, for we are demonstrating that our lives are better, actually that our world is better, is safer for having this convention in force and for the efforts of those who tend to it. The task assigned to me for this particular birthday gathering, then, is to recall some of the elements of the story leading up to entry into force of this convention. This allows me to avoid those moments during the past 40 years that we might all like to forget, to concentrate instead on those that we may have forgotten, or which for some reason we now overlook. I've chosen to recall just 3 elements of the story because I hope that as we start turning our minds towards the 8th Review Conference, they will serve as well to remember. These and others like them, can you go back please? Thank you. Come from an academic project examining the historical context of the biological weapons negotiations being funded by the UK's Arts and Humanities Council and involving Professor Brian Balmer and Dr. Alex Spelling of University College London and myself at the Sussex end of the Harvard Sussex programme. Slide, please. So let us quickly look over the familiar story of how it is that we came to entry into force of this convention, which often begins with the UK's initial draft, the alternative draft convention tabled by the Soviet and Socialist group countries, as well as the Nixon decision in 1969, the revised UK draft and the neutral and non-aligned memorandum in 1970, the many activities of 1971, before finally the convention opens for signature in 1972. All of these steps are indeed true. But this kind of recalling implies almost a logical march towards a finished treaty, a sense of inevitability that a universal ban on biological weapons would be achieved. But from our reading of the negotiation record, we can't honestly report that this inevitability is present. Instead, we find a more complex history. From the verbal records and written inputs to the negotiations, we observe conflicting views on a range of issues, some procedural, but others really quite fundamental. From the government papers we have so far studied, we observe differing views about the utility of biological weapons and the desirability and wisdom of there being a ban. So the first element of the BWC story that I wish to recall today, slide please, is that achieving the BWC was not inevitable. Especially for my generation that have never known there to be anything other than a universal ban on biological weapons, it can be a struggle for us to fully understand just how easily this convention could have been blown off course. Had we have been in this building 45 years ago, would we have had a strong conviction that a biological weapons treaty would be finalised and entered into force 5 years later? I don't think so. The UK had proposed its draft convention on biological weapons only, yes, but juxtaposed with that was the very much more popular idea that a ban should be sought simultaneously for both chemical and biological weapons, as illustrated by these 2 documents. On the left, the September 69 Alternative Draft Convention tabled to the UN General Assembly by the Soviet Union and Socialist group countries, and on the right, the neutral and non-aligned countries' joint memorandum. I highlight these 2 documents as illustrations that however practical and pragmatic we might now look back on the proposal from the UK to pursue a ban only on biological weapons, it was not popular at the time, really not popular. Alva Medal, then recently retired as Swedish ambassador to the CD when she wrote her book The Game of Disarmament, for example, noted that the objections of the neutral and non-aligned countries to the separation issue should not be thought of as a sign of excessive stubbornness, but were the result, she said, of bitter past experiences. Interestingly as well is that when we go back even further and we look at the US reactions when initially told of the UK plan, we see that they too were not so enamoured of the idea of a BW-only convention, though for different reasons than the other groups. Accepting the separation of biological weapons from chemical weapons and agreeing the final text on September 28, 1971, must have been a bitter pill to swallow for some. And we have had ramifications of that separation decision which have echoed through the decades since. Some of them have been positive, others not so positive. But had that pill not been swallowed, the very idea of the Biological Weapons Convention would not have come about, which brings me to my second point. To get from the agreed text to entry into force required much invisible work. Whether we're talking about Geneva-based discussions or work done in capitals, to get from the text being agreed to entry into force required enormous amounts of work, which I term invisible, because it's often overlooked, or at least under-acknowledged, sometimes simply because it's not known about until much later on. Between September 71 and March 75, most of this invisible work would have been done in capitals. In the United Kingdom, for example, the country which regarded itself as the creator of this convention, the amount of work that was required to align the views of different government departments, to bring them on board with the very idea of a convention, and to have each of them understand their responsibility towards the convention was extremely significant. And after all that had been done, one final burst of energy was required. Some of you might have noticed that on the timeline of the ISU special page for the 40th anniversary, the UK is listed as being the last of the depository countries to complete its internal process for the ratification of this convention. Indeed it was. But curiously, royal assent for the national legislation that is required to enact the Biological Weapons Convention had been given on the 8th of February 1974. So if royal assent, surely the highest authority in the land, had been given in February 74, why was there a 13-month delay until the UK's government determined that it had completed its internal processes for ratification? We were bemused. Until, that is, we discovered this document in the archives, a letter from the UK's Foreign and Commonwealth Office. As it notes, the UK had indeed taken the necessary measure of enacting domestic legislation, and this had received royal assent in February 74. However, the government of the day interpreted the Article 4 words under its jurisdiction and under its control anywhere, as meaning that having this Act apply only to England, Northern Ireland, Scotland and Wales was not sufficient for it to discharge of its responsibilities. Instead, what was considered necessary, and this was the purpose of the letter, was for this Biological Weapons Act to be extended, adapting for local conditions, to the 16 territories listed in paragraph 5 at the bottom of the slide. Strictly speaking, the UK did not have to interpret the words this way. Others didn't. But it did, and perhaps this may offer a partial explanation for the 13-month delay. This is a very specific example, but it is also one illustration of the huge amounts of invisible work that went on behind the scenes in capitals all over the world to get this convention entered into force. And such invisible work, of course, continues today. And so that brings me to my third point. The BWC was not a typical treaty. In his book, The Diplomacy of Biological Disarmament, international relations expert Nicholas Sims notes that although there was an accumulation of treaty-making experience, the BWC represented a break in that series of international treaties and bilateral agreements that were coming out in rapid succession during the period of the late 60s and early 70s. Unlike its predecessors, for example, the BWC did not stop short of actual disarmament, nor until a late stage did it proceed on the basis of identical drafts tabled by the superpowers. And it's this last point that I wish to dwell on for a moment. Although the United States and Soviet Union did eventually table identical drafts, the negotiation record clearly tells also of the active participation of one form or another, to one extent or another, of a host of other countries. This map, shown with current geographical borders, identifies those countries which are shown in the records as having participated in the BWC's negotiation process. This level of participation was of course enabled by the creation of the new institutional setup here in Geneva, the CCD, for each of these countries was member of the CCD at the time. In no way am I wishing to diminish the role played by the Soviet Union and the United States in the negotiations. My point is simply that every member of the CCD contributed in some way to what became the Biological Weapons Convention. The shaping of the treaty was therefore as global as was permitted by the institution from which it was born. Your Excellencies, colleagues, as this morning's event closes and we turn our minds from the past and towards the next 40 years, I hope that these three small remembrances of how we came to have this convention entered into force will say something to us all. But I wish for them also to speak to the work that needs to be done. So my final thoughts are these. First, there was nothing inevitable about the Biological Weapons Convention coming into being, and there is no inevitability to it being sustained. It was then and is now the product of collective commitments and of determined actions in support of biological disarmament. Second, to achieve entry into force, an enormous amount of effort and invisible work was required. To sustain it, now that it is in force and over the next 40 years, requires just as much, perhaps even more, of this sort of invisible work to be conducted both here in Geneva and in the capitals. And finally, the Biological Weapons Convention was not and is not a typical treaty. Amongst other things, the BWC was born from a process of multilateral diplomacy where each member of the negotiating body took part in shaping the end result. Success over the next 40 years will require this sort of continued multilateral effort, but increasingly it is also going to require new or renewed engagement with actors other than the state. It now only remains for me to provide you with the means to follow our project should you wish, to say thank you for your kind attention and to wish this convention a very happy 40th birthday. Thank you.